Lucas was an avid collector, always in search of rare and unusual pieces to add to his collection. During a trip to a small, isolated town, he came across an antique shop that seemed lost in time. The dusty windows and worn facade barely revealed what was inside. Curious, he entered, greeted by a dense and heavy atmosphere. The smell of old wood and forgotten objects seemed to carry something deeper. Everything there seemed to have a sinister story, but it was one particular object that caught Lucas's attention. At the back of the shop, between disorganized shelves and old furniture, he saw a small, peculiar-looking artifact. It had a soft glow, almost as if it were calling to him. It was a piece of dark metal, engraved with symbols Lucas didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar to him. The shopkeeper, a man with a tired and distant look, didn't seem interested in talking about the object. "Are you sure you want this?" was all he said before accepting Lucas's money and wrapping it in an old cloth. As soon as he left the shop, Lucas felt a strange connection to the artifact. He couldn't get it out of his mind, as if something was whispering in his head, drawing him in more and more. The way back home was accompanied by a growing sense of unease, but he ignored it, thinking it was just the fatigue from the trip. Little did he know that this simple object would change his life forever. Back in his apartment, Lucas couldn't contain his curiosity. He carefully unwrapped the object, once again feeling that strange magnetism emanating from it. The artifact looked even more impressive in the dim light of his living room, with the engraved symbols reflecting the light in a disturbing way. There was something enigmatic about those markings, something that seemed to vibrate at a frequency Lucas couldn't understand. He spent hours analyzing the object, touching its cold and detailed surfaces as if expecting it to reveal its secrets. As the days passed, the artifact began to occupy his thoughts in an almost obsessive manner. Whenever he wasn't working, Lucas found himself staring at it, trying to decipher the meaning behind those strange symbols. At night, the object seemed even more alive. He swore that at times the soft glow would increase slightly, as if something inside it was moving. Lucas started to feel a presence in the room, a sensation that he was no longer alone at home. Fascination soon turned into unease. Nightmares began to haunt his sleep, always involving the artifact in some way. What once seemed like just another collector's item started to take on a darker place in his life. Lucas still didn't know what he had purchased, but the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. Deep down, he knew he had meddled with something beyond his comprehension. The first signs that something was wrong began subtly. Lucas would wake up in the middle of the night with the sensation that someone was in the room, watching him. At first, he thought it was just accumulated fatigue, but soon the nightmares began to take over his nights. Whenever he closed his eyes, he was transported to strange, distorted places where shadowy figures seemed to whisper things he couldn't understand. In all these visions, the artifact was present, as if it were the center of all that torment. Every time he woke up, the atmosphere around him felt different. The shadows in the room seemed denser, and the silence in the house was unsettling. Lucas noticed that the object appeared to be shifting position when he wasn't looking, always subtly, as if it had a life of its own. He started avoiding the room where he had left the artifact, but the feeling of being watched persisted, as if the object was following him around the house. Lucas knew something was terribly wrong. He began to question whether his mind was playing tricks on him or if something more sinister was at play. The nightmares intensified with each passing night, and during the day he felt as if he were being drawn towards that cursed object. His initial fascination had turned into fear, but still he couldn't completely distance himself from the artifact. Something kept him bound to it, too. The intensification of paranormal events. As days passed, Lucas's behavior began to change. He started sleeping less, and his appearance reflected the exhaustion from sleepless nights. The deep, dark circles under his eyes and his paranoid gaze became part of his routine. However, what frightened him the most wasn't the physical fatigue, but the strange events now happening around him. Objects in his house started moving inexplicably. Sometimes he heard whispers in empty rooms, and whenever he approached, the sounds would stop, as if hiding something. The lights flickered and went out at random moments, plunging the house into an oppressive darkness. One day, while watching TV, the screen turned to static for a few seconds, and in the background, Lucas swore he saw a distorted shadow with glowing eyes staring directly at him. The shock made him jump from the couch, but the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. He started feeling like his own house was conspiring against him, with the artifact at the center of it all. The intensity of the phenomena increased daily, pushing Lucas to the brink of collapse. The air in the house felt heavier, almost suffocating. Lucas began avoiding going out at night, fearing what might happen while he was alone in the dark. His friends and colleagues noticed the change in his behavior, but he avoided talking about the artifact. He knew something evil was happening, but still couldn't understand what or why. He only felt that he was being watched by something beyond human comprehension. Desperate for explanations, Lucas decided to investigate the origin of the artifact. He spent hours scouring the internet, trying to identify the symbols engraved on the piece. The results were vague and confusing, but some esoteric websites mentioned a possible connection to ancient occult rituals. None of the information he found provided concrete answers, only fueling his fear and confusion. Lucas began to realize that by purchasing the object, he had become entangled in something much bigger than he could have imagined. With no other options, Lucas turned to antique specialists. He took photos of the artifact to specialized shops and museums, but most of the people he consulted had never seen anything like it. Some suggested it was a rare piece of unknown origin, but no one could offer details about its true function or purpose. The only thing everyone seemed to agree on was the discomfort the object caused. There was something about it that made even the experts hesitate to touch or delve too deeply into the matter. Every lead Lucas followed seemed to end in a dead end. Frustration mounted, and with it, the fear that he would never find answers. As the days passed, the sense of urgency grew stronger. He knew he needed to understand the story behind the artifact before something even worse happened. Yet, the information always seemed to slip through his fingers, leaving Lucas increasingly isolated in his solitary search for answers. After days of unsuccessful searching, Lucas finally found something that seemed to hold the key to understanding the artifact. On an obscure internet forum dedicated to collectors of rare and cursed objects, he stumbled upon an old post that mentioned an item with descriptions strikingly similar to the one he possessed. The post detailed that the artifact had passed through several hands over the centuries, and all of its owners had suffered violent and inexplicable deaths. The stories were chillingly detailed, each one ending in tragedy. As he read about the past owners, a shiver ran down Lucas's spine. He discovered that with each new victim, the artifact mysteriously returned to the shop from which it had been purchased, as if it was always searching for a new soul. The deaths varied, but they all shared one thing in common: signs of psychological torment that preceded the tragic end. Lucas could no longer deny the obvious. He had brought a cursed object into his life, one with a history of destruction that spanned centuries. What terrified him even more was the realization that he was already exhibiting the same symptoms reported by the artifact's previous owners: constant nightmares, paranormal events, and a growing sense of paranoia. Now everything made sense. The artifact wasn't just an ancient piece. It was a trap designed to ruin the life of whoever possessed it. Lucas wondered how much time he had left before becoming the next victim of that terrible curse. After discovering the artifact's terrible past, Lucas began to feel increasingly vulnerable. The weight of knowing about the curse deeply affected him. He could no longer relax, feeling as though death was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The constant tension began to interfere with his daily life. He avoided leaving the house, refused invitations from friends, and isolated himself completely. His obsession with understanding the artifact had turned into a paralyzing fear. The visions and nightmares became more intense. On one particularly horrifying night, Lucas dreamed he was trapped in a dark room, surrounded by the shadowy figures that always appeared in his dreams. They watched him in silence, and when he tried to escape, he felt invisible hands holding him back. He awoke in a cold sweat, his heart racing, and realized the shadows from his dream now seemed to fill his room, slowly moving across the walls, as if they were waiting for him. Reality and dreams began to blur, and Lucas could no longer distinguish what was real from what was a product of his fragile mind. Every time he looked at the artifact, he felt an oppressive presence, as if the object was alive, feeding off his fear. He knew he couldn't go on like this for much longer, but each day felt like a battle against the insanity that threatened to overtake him completely. Time seemed to be running out, and Lucas didn't know how much longer he could resist. Lucas knew his only chance of understanding the depth of the curse was to find someone who had dealt with the artifact before. After weeks of searching, he found a name: Henri Dumas, a man who, according to online records, was the only known survivor of the artifact's previous owners. Dumas lived in isolation in a decaying house, far from any major city. The state of seclusion he lived in was already a clear sign that something was terribly wrong with his story. When Lucas arrived at Dumas' house, he was greeted by a frail man with sunken eyes and a haunted expression. Dumas seemed to be a shadow of his former self, as if his vitality had been drained over the years. Realizing the reason for Lucas' visit, the old man immediately shut the doors and begged Lucas to get rid of the artifact. "I almost died. I was the only one who escaped," Dumas said with a trembling voice. He revealed that he had bought the object years ago, and his life had never been the same since. Dumas explained that after weeks of torment, he managed to survive the curse by getting rid of the artifact, returning it to the shop where he had bought it. However, he warned Lucas that the curse couldn't be broken, only passed on. The object would always find a new owner, and Dumas knew it was only a matter of time before death caught up with him. Now more terrified than ever, Lucas left Dumas' house with the grim realization that his fate was sealed, unless he could find a way to end the cycle of horror. Henri Dumas' words echoed in Lucas's mind as he made his way back home. The idea that the curse couldn't be broken, only passed on, filled him with despair. He knew he was racing against time, and what Dumas had said about escaping death only by getting rid of the artifact made Lucas feel even more trapped. There was no easy solution. Even if he managed to rid himself of the object, someone else would suffer the same terrible consequences. That night, as Lucas pondered what to do, he had another vision. The artifact stood before him, and the shadowy figures that haunted his nightmares began to approach. This time, however, they whispered something, as if they wanted to tell him a secret. It was then that he understood. The artifact wasn't just a curse, it was a catalyst for death, a trap created to seal the fate of its bearers. The true purpose of the piece was to devour the souls of those who possessed it, passing from person to person, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. With the revelation of the deadly secret, Lucas felt a mixture of terror and resignation. There was no way to completely escape the cycle. He was caught in a macabre game, and his only choice was how to face the inevitable end. Death seemed to be drawing nearer, and Lucas knew that to survive, he would have to confront the origin of the curse somehow. But the great question was, would he have the strength to face what was coming? After the revelation of the deadly secret, Lucas found himself on the verge of collapse. He tried desperately to escape the reality he was trapped in. He began ignoring the signs, distancing himself from everything connected to the artifact, and tried to convince himself that if he just forgot about the object, everything would return to normal. He avoided the artifact as much as possible, locking it away in a cabinet and throwing away the key. But even then, the feeling of being watched never disappeared. His mind tried to disconnect, but the curse kept pulling him back, each time with more intensity. Even in moments of denial, Lucas felt the weight of the malevolent presence. As he walked through the house, he could hear the whispers in the distance, a constant reminder that he couldn't escape. His friends reached out, concerned about his withdrawal, but he avoided contact, afraid of putting anyone else in danger. His paranoia only grew, and the attempts to live a normal life became increasingly impossible. He began to wonder if he was losing his sanity. No matter how hard he tried to escape, Lucas knew the artifact had power over him. It didn't matter where he hid it. The feeling of being watched never ceased. Reality was becoming distorted, and Lucas was sinking deeper into the cycle of the curse. He realized that the only way to end his torment was to face the truth and confront the object, or else his life, and perhaps his mind, would be lost forever. Running away was no longer an option. From the moment Lucas decided to lock away the artifact, the paranormal phenomena in his house escalated violently. He began to feel a physical presence around him, as if something invisible was following him through every room. At night, he was jolted awake by loud banging on the walls and furniture dragging itself across the floor. The shadows that once merely watched him now moved menacingly, taking on distorted human shapes that seemed to surround him. One particularly terrifying night, Lucas was in the living room when the lights began flickering violently. He heard shuffling footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was no one there. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and an invisible force slammed him against the wall, pinning him with such intensity that he could barely breathe. Desperate, he screamed, struggling to free himself from the oppressive energy, but it felt useless. The curse was growing more aggressive, and the artifact seemed to be coming to life. These attacks became more frequent, and Lucas felt completely powerless. What had once been just fear and paranoia had now turned into a physical battle against something he couldn't see or understand. He knew that if he didn't act soon, his life was in serious danger. Lucas could no longer ignore the artifact. It was clear that the curse had fully awakened, and the time he had to find a solution was quickly running out. Desperate and unsure of what else to do, Lucas made an extreme decision: destroy the artifact. If it was the source of all the evil surrounding him, destroying it seemed like his only way out. On a cold, silent night, Lucas retrieved the locked-up artifact and took it to his basement. With a hammer in hand and heavy breaths, he prepared to smash the object, believing that this would end the curse and free him once and for all. However, when he raised the hammer and struck the first blow, something terrible happened. The artifact didn't suffer a single scratch. Instead, the hammer cracked in half as if it had hit something indestructible. Lucas froze, staring in disbelief at the object, still intact, as if mocking his attempt. A disturbing sound began to echo through the basement, like a distant, macabre laugh. The darkness around him seemed to close in, and the room's temperature plummeted. A sense of helplessness consumed Lucas. He tried to destroy the artifact in other ways, burning it, smashing it, even immersing it in acid. Nothing worked. The object remained indestructible, as if protected by a force Lucas couldn't comprehend. With each failed attempt, the atmosphere grew more hostile, and Lucas felt his life being slowly drained by the artifact's power. At that moment, he realized there was no way to destroy it. His only option was to confront the curse head-on and find another solution before it was too late. Exhausted and desperate after his failed attempt to destroy the artifact, Lucas realized he had no other choices. The only path left was to face the problem head-on and seek answers at the source of it all, the antique shop where he had first found the object. The feeling of being hunted and tormented hadn't lessened, and he knew his time was running out. Every minute was a battle to maintain his sanity, but he was determined to end this, one way or another. On a stormy night, Lucas packed his things and set off toward the small town, determined to confront the shop owner and demand answers. The journey back was filled with dark thoughts and an increasing tension. He knew he was approaching something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Each mile seemed to drag him deeper into the abyss of the curse. As he drove, flashes of the nightmares he had been having flickered through his mind, as if something was trying to warn him about what awaited him. When he finally arrived at the shop, the same dark and suffocating atmosphere from his first visit surrounded him. Lucas stood before the place that had changed his life forever. He felt the weight of his decision and knew that, once he stepped inside, his life would never be the same. Even so, he took a deep breath, summoned all the courage he had left, and pushed open the door to the shop, ready to confront whatever awaited him. The final battle against the curse was about to begin. Upon re-entering the antique shop, Lucas was greeted by the same suffocating darkness that seemed to cling to the walls. The air, thick with dust and the scent of ancient objects, nearly choked him. The atmosphere felt even gloomier than before, as if the shop itself was alive, watching his every move. The shopkeeper, the same man with the weary gaze, stood behind the counter, motionless, as if he had been expecting Lucas all along. His eyes reflected the dark knowledge he carried, and the tension between them was palpable. Without wasting any time, Lucas approached and demanded answers. He recounted everything, the nightmares, the visions, and the supernatural events that had nearly destroyed him. The shopkeeper listened in silence, his expression suggesting he already knew every detail of Lucas's story. When Lucas finished, the man sighed, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He then revealed the truth about the artifact. The shop was merely a waypoint for the object, which always returned, seeking new souls to consume. Lucas realized that the artifact wasn't just a cursed item. It was part of an ancient and cruel cycle. The shopkeeper explained that the object had been created to feed a malevolent force, and any attempt to destroy it would be futile. The curse couldn't be broken, only passed on. The horror of that revelation weighed on Lucas like a death sentence. He had become entangled in something far greater than he could ever understand, and now he had to face the consequences. The shopkeeper, with his calm demeanor and deep voice, began to reveal to Lucas the true nature of the artifact. He wasn't just an antique dealer, he was the guardian of a centuries-old cycle. The artifact, he explained, had been created by an ancient cult that worshipped uncontrollable dark forces. Every person who owned the object was destined to suffer the consequences of the curse, being consumed by the power the artifact carried. As the guardian, it was his duty to ensure that the object always found a new bearer. Lucas was horrified to realize that the shopkeeper had known from the start what would happen to him. "I couldn't stop you from buying the artifact. It chose you," the man said with a coldness that sent chills down Lucas's spine. The truth about the shopkeeper's role was even more disturbing. He couldn't break the cycle, only facilitate it. Every time the artifact claimed a soul, it returned to the shop, ready to be sold to a new victim. The shopkeeper explained that he had witnessed countless deaths over the years, all following the same pattern. No matter what Lucas tried to do, he was destined to share the same tragic fate. The cycle was unbreakable, a force greater than any human could control. Lucas felt the ground collapse beneath him. It was clear. There was no escape. He was trapped in a macabre game that the shopkeeper helped keep alive. After hearing the shopkeeper's explanation, Lucas felt an overwhelming emptiness inside. It was as if all his efforts to fight the curse had been for nothing. The truth was undeniable. He had no control over the fate that awaited him. The artifact, like every other object in that shadowy shop, was condemned to repeat the same cycle of horror, and Lucas was now a part of that dark history. The terror of knowing he was trapped in this cycle consumed him, but he knew he still had one choice: accept it or make one final attempt to escape. As he tried to process everything, the artifact he had brought back to the shop began to emit that soft glow, the same one that had drawn him in from the start. Now, Lucas clearly understood what that glow meant. It was calling for its next victim. He looked at the shopkeeper, who simply nodded in silent confirmation of what Lucas already knew. The cycle would always restart. Without a word, the shopkeeper took the artifact from Lucas's hands and placed it on a shelf in the back, as though preparing for the next person who would inevitably fall into the trap. Lucas left the shop in a state of dark resignation. He knew his life would never be the same, and that the curse still followed him, lurking in the shadows. The only thing he could do now was try to survive as long as possible, knowing that the artifact would soon find another owner. The cycle would continue just as it had for centuries, and Lucas was merely another piece in this macabre puzzle. With Lucas gone, the sinister atmosphere of the shop seemed to calm, as if it were waiting, ready for its next move. The artifact rested on its shelf, now shrouded in the same dim light in which Lucas had first found it. The shopkeeper, silent, rearranged the surrounding objects, preparing the space for the next visitor. Time passed indistinctly until, on a rainy afternoon, a new customer entered the shop. It was a young man, curious, wandering through the place in search of something unique to gift a friend. His eyes were immediately drawn to the soft glow of the artifact on the shelf. Just like Lucas before him, the young man couldn't look away. Fascinated by the piece, he approached and picked it up, feeling an inexplicable magnetism. The shopkeeper watched from a distance, not interfering, knowing that the cycle was about to begin again. Without hesitation, the young man asked the price, and the guardian of the shop, with the same distant gaze, made the sale without offering any warning. The artifact, once again, was ready to continue its dark mission. As the young man left the shop with the artifact in his hands, the malicious cycle had been reset. The shopkeeper slowly closed the door, knowing the object would soon return to claim another victim. The terror Lucas had faced was far from over. The artifact would continue its trail of destruction, consuming life after life until its insatiable hunger was satisfied. And so, the next target had been marked, unaware that his fate had already been sealed. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. If this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and if you can, support us with a small coffee through the link in the pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to continue bringing you these thrilling stories. And if you enjoyed this video, I'm leaving another story up here that will move you even more. Click and find out what happens next. You won't want to miss it.